All right.
There you go.
Okay, I'm being recorded. Well, Chag Sameach to you all. Thank you for turning out on Erev Shavuot for a little study. Um, so I've got a very, very broad topic, the relationship between Reform Judaism and Jewish law. So can I know you can wave, put up a hand or whatever, but how many of you even have heard the term responsa? Yes, no. Okay, so good. Some yes, some no. So responsa is a Latin term, plural, right? Singular responsum. The Hebrew term is shelot utshuvot, questions and answers. And it's a genre of rabbinic literature that goes back 1500 years. When somebody has a question about how should we proceed here, what does Jewish law, halacha, what does it tell me to do? I have a new situation I've never encountered before, or I don't have access to the books or whatever. But particularly when I encounter a new situation and I don't know what to do, what's the what's the Jewish way to proceed? And people have historically sent questions off to rabbis who become known as authoritative. The Hebrew is posek, decisor, yeah, poskim. In Yiddish, to pasken, to make a decision about Jewish law. And there are literally thousands of volumes of responsa, going back, as I said, about 1500 years. And these represent a kind of real honest to goodness in the moment case law, as it were. What do we do? And there are uh, it's a system. Imagine, for example, that there were no in the U.S. legal system. Imagine there were no Supreme Court. Okay, so we had only regional, courts, and so something could be constitutional in the Ninth Circuit and unconstitutional in the Fourth Circuit, and or vice versa, and there would be no final decision regarding that. And Jewish law is very much like that because there has not been a single central recognized authority for well over 1,000 years. And even when there was, the Gaonim, right, the rabbinic authorities of the academies in Babylon, the only thing that made them authoritative was that they had the backing of the caliph. And so their answers were authoritative for the 90% of Jews who lived in the Muslim world at the time. So responsa are very, 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 very diverse. There are some, and this is still going on. And I actually didn't want to spend most of tonight talking about responsa per se, although I will say you can find we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reform responses. The reform movement has used this genre of literature as well. And they are all up on the CCAR website. They are all open to the public. Anybody can look at them and see them. But the interesting question to me, and what I did want to talk about tonight, is what's involved in this question of a movement that had its origins in saying we are not bound by halacha, we are not bound by Jewish law. how do we then and why do we turn to Jewish law? How and why do we do this? And so I wanted to look at one of the most famous famous one of the most obscure, famous, significant controversies in Reform Judaism, because to me, this is like the the scene that sort of puts everything into context. Okay. So um but before we do that, just a little bit of history. Um uh as Rabbi Cohen said, I am the chair of the CCAR Responsive Committee. Let me tell you how the Responsive Committee got started. Okay. In the early 1900s, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the Association of Reform Rabbis in North America, was in the process of creating what they then called a minister's handbook, um, rabbi's manual, we call it now, okay, for life cycle events. And they were putting together this booklet. This is what you do at at a bris. This is what you do at a wedding. This is what you do at a funeral. Yada yada. Uh, the committee putting this together reported back to the convention in 1906 saying, we propose at the end of this booklet, of this book, we're going to have a section called halachot, okay, which means literally, anybody know? Halacha, halachot. Okay, so halacha from the verb to walk, holech, okay, halacha, the path or the walking, but generally translated as law, Jewish law. Halachot, laws, okay? Um, they said, we want rabbis in the conference to know this is why, for example, we have decided that a wedding should be conducted this way. This is why we have decided that a funeral should be conducted this way. This is why, why we use this formula, why we do this, why we do that, why, we don't say Kaddish for 11 months, we say it for 12, et cetera, et cetera. There was this huge storm of protest at the convention. Okay. People flipped out when they heard the term halachot. And rabbis were yelling and saying, I mean, it's all in writing, but you can hear them yelling. We're reform. We didn't become reform rabbis to set up a new Shulchan Aruch, a new guide to Jewish law. I never tell my people what they should do. If they want to sit Shiva for 7 days, if they want to sit for 3 days, if they want to go back to work immediately, I'm not going to tell them what they should do in terms of practice. Okay. And somebody else said, yes, but what about all those younger rabbis coming up who have not been through this process as we all have of moving from our traditional upbringings to reform and, making these decisions. So the in the end, what they did was they compromised and they said, we're not going to put this section in the minister's handbook. We're just going to put this is what you do for funerals, what you do for a wedding, etc. But if any of our younger colleagues would like to know why we do these things or what should we do, we will establish a committee and we will call it the Responsa Committee, and it will produce decisions just like traditional rabbis have written responsa, but it will not, its decisions will not be authoritative or binding on the movement as a whole. It will simply be advisory for any rabbi or any later for any Reform Jew, but they intended it as a kind of resource for rabbis. If you want to know why we do this way. Here's how we will explain it. Okay. We have consulted the rabbinic sources, and here is the decision we will come to. Okay. Any questions about this? Comments, questions? Anybody see any complications down the road here? Yes,
Well,
go
the
ahead.
complications that come to mind is that nobody has to agree to go along with it. So basically, to me, the committee is basically looking for consensus, if you will. And then, the way that consensus works is that if everybody agrees, it happens. If everybody doesn't agree, it doesn't happen. Is that what happened?
Yes, essentially, decisions that are taken by a plenum of the CCAR, however many rabbis show up to the convention in any given year and vote yes or no on some decision, that is then binding. That is considered an authoritative CCAR position. But if you bring the same question to the responsive committee and they come to a different decision than the CCAR plenum, the responsive committee's decision is not binding. Yeah. So, for example, that happened in 1995. The responsive committee was asked whether a rabbi may officiate at a same-sex wedding ceremony. And it was highly, highly, highly divisive, contested, harsh uh, conversation. And the committee itself was unable to reach consensus, so it issued a tshuva, a responsum with a majority and a minority opinion. And the majority said no, and the minority said yes. And then 5 years later, the CCAR passed a resolution saying, yes, this is perfectly acceptable, right? And made no reference to the responsive committee's decision. Yeah. Other things have happened as well, but what I really, really find even more interesting is this question of why do we need a responsive committee, and how do we as Reformed Jews work out these questions of what are we going to do? Because what we now refer to as classical reform, which peaked in the late 19th century, right? And we can sort of date it through 1914. By the time we get to the post-war period, we're in a different generation. We're in a different intellectual context. We're in a different context altogether. But classical reform is rooted in this idea. We get it from both of the rabbis who are regarded as the intellectual precursors of reform, Abraham Geiger and Samuel Holdheim, both distinguish between ethics and ritual, right? And Abraham Geiger is responsible in the 19th century for this notion that the core of Judaism is ethical, right? It's ethics. That's the kernel, and the rituals are the shell that preserved these things. So why did Jews have to use rituals to keep themselves separate? It's so that this ethical monotheistic core values, Jews preserved themselves as a distinct group, so that all of this wonderful ethical material would not get lost in the barbarism of, of the whole rest of the world. And now that we're in the 19th century and everybody is finally catching up to us and everybody else is becoming ethical and rational too, we don't need to be so separate, right? So what's the point of ritual? Ritual uh, is the point of ritual is to inculcate feelings of piety and spirituality, right? So ritual, if it makes you, if ritual therefore is utilitarian, if it makes you feel spiritual, you should keep it. If it no longer makes you feel spiritual, you should either modify it or discard it. And in the late 19th century, people like David Einhorn and Kaufman Kohler and all of these leading Reform rabbis were very, very certain that they knew, they were so linear and they were so rational, right? Everything goes from primitive to advanced, from irrational to irrational, right? From uh, religions go from primitive to advanced. So they knew, they literally said, we can tell you which Jewish rituals are outmoded and must be discarded. We can show you scientifically, and which ones need to be preserved, right? So, for example, uh, kashrut is a primitive taboo system that we no longer need. So this is primitive. We should not maintain it because it no longer has spiritual value. We can tell you scientifically there's no spiritual value in dietary laws, um, and so on and so forth. But they ran aground on the the rock of the fact that some that it's not very easy to live as a Jew without doing. Um, and this becomes most clear in the early 20th century debates that the CCAR has over Shabbat observance. Okay. Shabbat is the pinnacle of ethical monotheism, right? A day of rest. The fact that we are not just automatons who toil, right? This is the Shabbat as the pinnacle of creation, rest as opposed to toil, et cetera, et cetera. But they come up against this question of how do we define Shabbat? Okay, what does it mean to observe Shabbat? If you have this wonderful ethic of rest, what constitutes rest and what constitutes work? And so it's 120 years ago already, but this debate over how are we going to observe Shabbat brings out every question about how do Reform Jews engage with the tradition? How do we go about making changes? How do we know what's constant and what is transitory, right? And how do we know when we need to be countercultural, right? And not go along with the majority society? And how do we know when we should? So we've now taken up almost half of this time, just sort of laying into this, but are you guys okay with what I have and what I wanted to share my screen with? I have this It's my own synopsis of this conversation. Okay. And I would love a couple of volunteers. Is there anybody who really likes reading aloud and, kind of doing dramatic readings? Anybody comfortable with that? Shayna. Okay.
Hi.
Hi. Would you like to be a reader?
Sure, I can help out a bit. Some other folks did raise their hands as well. I don't know
Okay,
if
who
they're
else am I seeing?
popped up.
Christine, and one more. Susan? Okay, so this stuff is color coded. All right. So I need one person and there's a lot of blue and there's a lot of green and a little bit of red. So who wants to read a lot of blue?
Dana, it's up to you.
I was going to put the ball in your court, Christine.
All right. Well, you know what, Shayna, I saw you first. You're going to get the blue. Christine, you're going to get the green. Who's going to get the red? Susan. All right. I'm going to open this up and share my screen. Share screen. All right. Are you all seeing this? How shall we observe Shabbat?
Yeah, if you can
Yeah?
make the font a
Can I
little,
make it even bigger? Yes, I can. How's that? Is that
That's
is
good.
that good enough?
What about everybody else? I think it's great.
Yes, that's very good.
All right. So my blue reader, okay, Jacob Vorsanger, all right? Take it
Jacob
away.
Vorsanger. The question of Shabbat observance is the most important question facing us. We Reform rabbis don't want to cause a split in the Jewish community by doing something really radical, but what are we supposed to do about the fact that virtually all of our people ignore Shabbat? Can we revive it, or should we move it to Sunday? There are 3 reasons for this problem. 1, the religious reason. In the past, Shabbat was the norm in the Jewish community, and all Jews observed it because it was in the Torah. But we don't live in a closed Jewish community, and these days no one, including us rabbis, believes that the Torah was divinely revealed. 2, the economic reason. In this country, the business pressures are overwhelming. The only Jews who are able to observe Shabbat in this country are the immigrants who live in the city neighborhoods where there are all masses of Jews concentrated in certain industries. Our people don't live that way, however. 3, the social reason. We are influenced by the culture around us. Theoretically, it is possible to live fully in 2 cultures, but practically, it can only be done in very special circumstances. Besides, it is our duty to be fully assimilated into American life, and that means that we cannot allow ourselves to retain any practices that prevent us from fully sharing and completely in American life. Furthermore, our people are Americans. When they have free time, they want to spend it in American-style modern leisure activities, not in traditional Shabbat rest, sitting and doing nothing. But I am afraid that if we move Shabbat to Sunday, we Reform Jews will become a separate Jewish sect that will be cut off from the main body of Judaism within 3 or 4 generations.
Okay. Any reactions just to that? Comments? Anything there? Yeah, quickly. Yeah. Go ahead.
This is a very assimilationist place. It doesn't do like the garden salad of what it means to be an American. This is basically melting pot theories. and it seems very archaic. I mean, reading it now, and I think there isn't as much difficulty, especially post-pandemic, with the notion that you can do Shabbat as it was previously, right?
So
Yeah.
And also the purpose is much clearer, that it's important to mark identity, because it has become something which every group is faced with, and there's a commitment by most groups to not preserving, but to keeping alive the rituals that mark identity.
Yeah, it's much easier to be pluralist now than it was then. Yes, Betsy.
On the other hand, I find this completely relevant to today, even though it was written so long ago. We have the exact same issues. And for most of the Jewish population, Shabbat on Saturday is not Shabbat in any traditional sense. People are shopping and driving, and there's a total, it's ignored. It could be on Sunday. I don't think that much has changed in terms of these arguments, these concerns.
Yeah. I'm seeing Harvey's hand is up.
Hi, I was thinking, I'm the reform. I'm a reform by nature, but I can see where someone who's a little bit more conservative, a little bit more orthodox, would say something like this is with Satan sitting on your shoulder as you write it.
Satan?
Satan?
Well, just just some kind of entity that's taking you down a different path. Not necessarily Satan in the sense of that's just a commonly used term.
Oh, well, for sure, in the traditional community, they were not having this conversation. I mean, they were having conversations. They were also having conversations about Shabbat observance or the lack thereof. But and they were aside from the fact, aside from his comment about believing that the Torah was divinely revealed, these same problems are happening for all Jews in this country at the time. So the diagnosis here is not uniquely reform. But let's go on, because I know our time is limited. So we're going to skip this. Who's my green person? Go ahead.
Okay. Hyman Enlow. I was disappointed in Forsangers because he was afraid to follow his own thoughts to their logical conclusion. The real problem is that our people don't have the opportunity for a real Shabbat, and we need to think about what this means for the future. If I were Orthodox or a Zionist, and I believed that someday the Jews would go back to the land of Israel and have a country of our own, then I would say that we should just wait out this bad situation. But we aren't Orthodox and we aren't Zionists, and so it's obvious to us that the whole idea of a return to Israel is just a pipe dream. And there is no way that American social, economic, or industrial conditions are going to change either. So we just have to come to terms with them. Our people are just going to get progressively more westernized and assimilated, and they will drift further and further away from Jewish tradition. So we need to make changes to keep up with them. The fact is that Sunday is already our day of rest, so why not make it official? Lewis Wolseley. Why are we trying to stick with an historical institution that reason tells us is outmoded? So what if changing the Sabbath would be a break with Jewish history? Our entire modern Judaism is a break with Jewish history. To me, staying with the traditional Shabbat feels like I am being inconsistent in my reform, but I will be bound by whatever the CCAR decides.
Okay. Just briefly, comments, reactions to Anilo and Woolsey?
I'm curious why they're focusing so much on the Sunday, Saturday, rather than what happens to any day of rest. It's really, the issue is what is it about the conditions of life that prevent people from taking any kind of time off?
Let's remember that this is 1902,
No,
and
I
they're right,
understand that.
and
This is
they're,
a while ago.
like everything closed down on Sundays.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I learned from one of my students writing his senior thesis a few years ago that uh, there was a huge reaction against Sunday baseball games. And
Mhm.
in many venues, you could not play baseball on Sunday into the 1920s.
Wow,
Yeah, so
okay.
yeah, we forget the extent to which Sunday was a public day of rest in this country. Yeah. Yeah. I see Shayna's hand is up and then Betsy. Sorry.
A question that stood out to me through both colors of the text is, are they talking about what day Shabbat should be on? Or are they talking about how to be Jewish outside of a shtetl and how to be assimilated and Jewish? It seems
Yes,
like there's so much political and social implication just brought through this entire thing.
exactly.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. Betsy was going to say something as well.
Sorry, I froze for a moment. It's interesting to me that I don't know if I'm freezing here. It makes me respect how, how passionate the reform movement was in trying to figure this out. These are very, very big issues, and it's a relatively new movement, and they're really struggling, and I really respect that. On the other hand, I am so glad that the reform movement has evolved into a more, traditional. I mean, not traditional in the sense like orthodox or even conservative, but that it has gone a little bit in the other direction, and that we don't have conversations today about Shabbat on Saturday or Sunday. I mean, whether you observe Shabbat on Saturday or night or your Shabbat is Friday night, Shabbat is, we know what it is. And I'm glad for that, even if there's flexibility in how it's observed within the reform movement and among people who identify as Reform Jews.
Yeah, I think this, if we had the time, we could follow it through and look at a whole bunch more texts. But the reform movement these days is not utzed over Shabbat observance, right? But this is sort of the paradigmatic case because you've got, right? But we are utzed over other things, and we have been utzed over other things. This same dynamic of, can we break with the tradition? Can we not? We had the same dynamic over uh, um, of officiation at mixed marriages, patrilineal descent, um, um, other matters of same-sex officiation, um, uh, we're being the questions are being raised now about other questions related to gender and gender identity. So there are all kinds of, like there's always the issue du jour in which we're being asked to weigh these questions of how far are we going to go. Most recently, we were asked about, the responsive committee was asked about physician assisted dying. And you're in California, and it's legal there within reasons. We were asked by somebody from Canada, where it's also legal. So uh, that also was a kind of, are we going to be consistent, or are we going, are we going to stay within the bounds of what the majority of the Jewish community says, or are we going to make some kind of a break with it? But can we go back to the text? Is that okay? Or are you have we seen enough? You want to see how it turns out?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
See how it turns out. Okay, so I need my blue reader again, right? Because Max Heller stepped up to back up Jacob Vorsanger.
Max Heller. We should consider this issue not in the light of the last 50 years, but the last 3,000. The difference between being modern and Western, as opposed to old-fashioned and Oriental, is not a matter of being progressive or backwards. The difference is in quality of life. Modern life is not perfect. It is too hurried. It needs to be calmer. What we see as progress is really a decline in some ways. Besides, I don't think that we should change the day of Shabbat just because some Jews want to make more money. Lots of Jews are content to remain poor but Sabbath observing. We haven't even tried very hard to get the blue laws changed.
Keep going. Yeah,
Can't
Jacob.
we figure out
Yeah, sorry. Jacob Vorsanger.
Any way that we rabbis can constitute an authoritative body that our Jews will listen to so that we can figure this out. We all agree that we aren't just Unitarians, no matter how liberal and open we are. If we want our people to retain even a minimal connection with their past, then we have to find a way of directing them as to what more liberal Jewish observance ought to be.
Yeah. Okay, right. So here you see them struggling with this. We got to come up with something, but how? Right. Yes. Rabbi, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you. How many Zoom calls have I been on and I still forget to unmute? I just have two quick observations. One, in 1902, although this is an in-house conversation among Jews, there's a real sense here of feeling relatively comfortably, feeling a relatively comfortable part of a larger whole. Just as a quick aside, I once read a paper a long time ago, short paper that the subject was how at a certain point Isaac Mayer Wise found, who was then the big chief in Reform Judaism, explored with the Unitarians about the possibility of merger. And the conclusion of the author was, however Unitarian the Unitarians were, they were still Jesus in the background, so it couldn't go any farther. The second is, there's no sense here about the Torah, what the Torah commands. There's no sense of, the best we got is, let's think about 3,000 years and not 50. But there's no sense of, standing in the face of what we ought to do, which is how modern Orthodoxy functions. We can do what we ought to do in terms of our own belief system and still be part of the larger society. Those are just two quick observations about what I see going on here, which I find very interesting in 1902.
Yeah, the terms of the conversation are very different. And it has you can see them being influenced by 19th century ideas about the nature of religion, right? And then you really start to see the change in the 1920s when you start getting rabbis in the CCAR who are they're starting to read Buber, right? They're starting to read even Rosenzweig, some of them, because they all read German. as the 1920s go on, they're starting to read about, a little bit about Rudolf Otto and different ideas about religion as experience, as as something, and as opposed to religion as a kind of uber rational. They're no longer, but these guys are so rational. They're such rationalists, you know. Uh, so so they keep arguing, right? So that was 1902. They decide they're going to have papers about it. So the two big opponents, Vorsanger and Anelo, present papers, right? So here is what they have to say, and notice how the terms of the conversation now change. So Shana, you're my blue reader, right?
Okay, I'll do my best to keep going.
Are you
Jacob
okay? Do you want
Yes,
somebody
I'm
else to-
okay. We'll do this bit. Yes. Jacob Vorsanger. I believe that there is a lot that the CCAR can do to strengthen Shabbat observance. But first, we need to clarify the question of our authority. We are too disorganized and anarchic. You can't have a religious community if it doesn't share a commitment to a common discipline. We don't want to go back to the days of the Shulchan Aruch, but there has to be some middle ground between rigid authority and total anarchy. In this country, we rabbis have no legal authority over the Jews, but we still have a responsibility to teach. The problem is, if we teach that the congregation should be doing something and some individual doesn't like it, that individual just quits the congregation. In these conditions, can we retain any sense of disciplined religious observance? And can we Reform rabbis retain any shred of rabbinic authority? We can't answer those questions. We're great at giving platitudinous answers about how we are loyal to the ethical teachings of Judaism, but that's not very specific. And it doesn't say anything about the distinctiveness of Reform Judaism as opposed to any other form of modern liberal thinking. I'm not sure Reform will survive if it doesn't have some of the same kind of religious discipline as traditional Judaism has had. What our people need right now is a guide to tell them exactly what they are required to do as Reform Jews, to tell them whether there is anything they have to do other than to be ethical people. This question of Shabbat really demonstrates that Reform Jews collectively need some kind of authority.
Okay, comments? Questions, Christine?
Well, this, of course, by excluding women, it really doesn't really give you a whole lot of range here about who's authoritative. But also, well, it leaves, as Rabbi said, it leaves out the Torah. And one of the things that I find anchoring, today is Torah study, and that involves questioning the text and doing it collectively. So that it's the very process of the questioning and the going over the text and trying to figure out what this means for today that defines the group as very distinct vis-a-vis other kinds of religious communities. And I think that's kind of missing here. He's sort of clinging to rabbinic authority at the expense of this richness of the congregations that could be helping.
Okay, yeah. Betsy, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very much based on an old model of what the rabbi was in the community. And I totally agree with what Christine said. And I also think the Reform movement has evolved over the years and found, in a way, its raison d'etre in Tikkun Olam, its ethical core in Tikkun Olam. And I think that has really helped ground the movement, both that issue in Tikkun Olam and what Christine said about being open, that we're a people who struggle with the questions. We wrestle with, the angel. That's our job. That is Reform Judaism. And I think that I don't think Reform rabbis are any less respected or, any less strong voices in their community. I think we've just moved a long way from authority figures. That's not what we're looking for in our rabbi, to tell us what to do. I mean, sometimes you need counseling, and but I don't think that's the role anymore. I think it's changed so much since 1903. It's evolved.
Jason?
Yeah, Jason.
Yeah, well, there's something I was just thinking about from the past week, a couple of examples of where, sometimes it's helpful if the rabbi has a little bit of a strong hand in directing people when they don't know what they're doing. I mean, Rabbi Cohen was very nice the other night and pointed out that many people were not bowing in the Baruch at the right time. And he kind of paused and explained it to people who maybe they'd heard it before, maybe they hadn't. And, people want to do things right, and, when we went up for Aliyot, he guided people on, here's where you touch with the tzitzit. And, like, people want to observe in a way that at least has some degree of authority and isn't random. And it's nice to have somebody who has authority and information and can tell you this is an acceptably right way to do certain things. And it is kind of true that our Friday night service has a little randomness of people singing at the times that aren't necessarily the time to sing and bowing at points that are not necessarily the right ones. And there is something to be said for actually having a communal knowledge and some degree of authority. And I'm just picking on little things from the service, but it doesn't hurt to have somebody tell you this is actually the way you're supposed to do it. And I think people want to hear that. I mean, not everybody's going to do it, but I think most people would like to be in at least to some degree observing in a way that is considered correct, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. Christine, I'm collecting all these comments here.
One of the things that I'm reminded of in this conversation is agreeing with Jason, is Hannah Arendt's notion of not authoritarian, but authority versus power over. And where you go to somebody who has an authority because they know something you want to know, right? And that's not power over somebody, that's not ruling, that is basically sharing knowledge that will benefit everyone. And that's how I see the modern rabbinic role, which is be a source of knowledge, be a source of something that you can a view of Torah that you can engage and things like that. So I mean, it's a very much more inviting kind of role than the traditional image anyway of the rabbi.
Yeah.
And I think, Christina, you're just saying the rabbi is a teacher. We want the rabbi to be a teacher.
So,
Christine, Sherry Bachman has a question.
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing everybody here, so I didn't mean to. Sorry, Sherry. Yes.
Oh, just a comment. I agree with Jason and Christine completely about we need some kind of consensus, maybe. The word authority bothers me because I think the one attraction to Judaism is that it doesn't have an authoritarian dogma. And I think at this point in 2024, people can make their own decisions how they want to observe the Sabbath. Some people do, some people don't observe it completely. And I think that, yes, you need some kind of teaching from a rabbi, but I think also you need to make sure that Judaism is particularly Reform, because that's how I was raised, that you have choices of how you are going to observe. Some like candles, some don't. but they still observe a Sabbath. So I think the word authority just bothers me because the attraction of Judaism is having choices and being non-authoritarian.
Yeah, Rabbi?
Yeah, so again, two quick observations. One, what Forsanger seems to be wishing for is something about the old days when there was, actually I have three observations, but when the rabbi did have a stronger authority in, you know, I mean, that's at least the image of, you know, especially Eastern European Jewish communities where the rabbi did, you know, the rabbi determined whether the chicken was kosher or not, and things of that nature. And that's lost in America in most corners of the Jewish community, except I guess arguably the Orthodox community. But what I'm also interested in, because you know, in my day, you know, the definition of reform, which is kind of what Sherry said, was to be seen in the understanding of the word autonomy, which I think actually Eugene Borowitz invented. He didn't invent the word autonomy, but he invented its application as a way of doing Reform Judaism. And then he modified it late in his career, which he called it the autonomous Jewish self. But it's interesting because it was always spoken of as if this was always articulated as the case, that we always understood that as individuals, we have autonomy. But that's what's developing. It may already be de facto the case that people had autonomy, but it wasn't yet articulated as a fundamental principle of liberal Judaism. And so as a historical moment, I find this kind of interesting. In 1903, Forsanger doesn't seem to know, I'm sure he knows the word autonomy, I'm sure he's read Kant and all that, but he doesn't know the word autonomy as a factor for determining what it means to be a liberal Jew. And the other thing is, and Betsy kind of caught this, part of what you guys are talking about is the distinction between authority in some hard way and what's called soft authority, which is an authority that, you know, that, like using the example that Jason used. Now, by the way, those of you who weren't at services Friday night, I did not stop the service and demand that everybody do the Baruch Hu my way. But the nature of the service that night seemed to allow me to, you know, take a moment and say this is the traditional way of doing it. I didn't jump up and down and turn my face turn red or anything like that.
I hope I didn't imply that. That was not the.
You did not, but I wanted to make that clear. But that's a kind of soft authority. You know, I say in a traditional worshiping of the Baruch Hu, you know, it's a call and response, and people can listen to me or not listen to me, but it's an exercise of authority that then, like, as Betsy pointed out, then people become the authority themselves. That's kind of what soft authority means.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm gonna jump in here just to say, like, because I think we're reading Vorsanger in terms, like, in terms of our present, and this is it's a serious issue. But if you go back to, you know, and by the way, this is all paraphrased, right? All of these speeches were much longer, so this is all paraphrased and kind of cut down. So and in some ways, when I paraphrased it, I tried to bring out what they're trying to get at. But when he says there has to be some middle ground between rigid authority and total anarchy, it's not just the reason that this whole debate started is, if you look at some of the comments we skipped over, they are rabbis who don't know how to answer their congregants when their congregants say, Rabbi, what does it mean to observe the Sabbath as a Reformed Jew? Okay. They literally don't know how to answer this question because they are operating in this paradigm that says ethics, absolute ethics are from Sinai, ritual is not, right? But it's the doing of Shabbat. Shabbat is by definition what you do and what you don't do, right? Even if you say, as we do now, if any of you have seen that marvelous, one of the best things that the CCAR ever published is Gates of Shabbat by our late colleague, Rabbi Mark Shapiro, Oliver Shalom, who tries to offer a framework for Reform Jews to think through what it means to observe Shabbat. And he gives, here's the traditional paradigm, here is a Reform paradigm, here's how you can think through this knowledgeably. But these guys are so far away from getting to that point. They're really, really struggling with, we don't even understand our relationship to the tradition. And we don't understand how, what does this mean to us as rabbis? We don't know what to tell people. And we have a real crisis on our hands. And we today cannot, you cannot imagine how non-observant Reform Jews were at that point in time, and every single year the rabbis, when they get together at the conventions, they are saying the same things. Our people are not coming. They find the services are cold. We made all these changes. We built beautiful organs. We have beautiful choirs. And yet they're not finding it meaningful, and people are complaining, and they're all running off to Christian Science. I don't know if you know this, but there were tremendous numbers of Reform Jews who were attracted to Christian Science in the early 20th century because of its warmth and spirituality. And so they're all talking about Christian Science. So they're really, really struggling here with, how do we as Reformed Jews read our tradition? Can we tell people, can we even give people guidance? Can we even begin to do that? And if so, how? Right? So can we go on and see Anilo's response? Right? These are short précis of what were very, very long papers. So I need my green reader.
I'm an Enlo. Already in 1846, the Rabbinical Conference in Breslau had trouble dealing with Shabbat questions because participating in the larger society made it impossible to observe the Shabbat. Most of those rabbis were so conservative by nature, all they could do was offer Talmudic-style arguments as to how they might permit certain modern activities on the Sabbath. Samuel Holdheim was the only one with the guts to stand up and say that it was clear that the Sabbath had to be moved to Sunday. Abraham Geiger, too, rejected the majority approach, but he didn't have another answer. He left it for the future generations to solve. Well, we American Jews are the future to which Geiger was referring, and the fact is we are committed to participating fully in the life of this country. And I tell you that it is impossible to participate fully in an American economic and intellectual life while being a Saturday Shabbat observer. Furthermore, our people don't even feel guilty anymore over violating the Shabbat. They have absolutely no consciousness of the specialness of that day. So if we want to keep from sounding like ridiculous hypocrites, if we really want to preserve the Shabbat, we need to look at what the purpose of Shabbat is and to see how we can preserve that purpose in the modern world. Since I believe that Judaism has evolved, I have studied the evolution of the Shabbat from modern scholarly perspective. My studies lead me to conclude that the original purpose of the Shabbat was a day of worship and ethical upliftment. All the prohibitions of work were merely a means to an end, to make sure that the people were free to engage in those activities. Rabbinic Judaism put the cart before the horse when it made rest on the Sabbath and refraining from all kinds of activities, the central point of the day. So I think we should drop all this stuff about Shabbat as a symbol of rest, either because God supposedly rested on the seventh day, or because it is supposedly connected to the Exodus from Egypt. And we should instead revive the true original spirit of the Shabbat to make it a genuine religious institution. In order to do that, we have to bite the bullet and move the Shabbat to Sunday. That is the only possible solution if we are serious about making it a true day of worship and religious edification. Judaism, above all, is based on spiritual ideas. The idea is always more important than the way it is expressed. Lots of things have been changed over time, so why not now? Some people think it would be a problem if some Jews observe Saturday and others on Sunday as the Sabbath. I don't. We will be more united by our faithfulness to the idea than divided by the difference in our practice.
Okay. So, what do you think of Anilo's position?
I just don't see how moving it to Sunday would resolve any of it.
Well, again, not Sunday as it is now. Sunday as it was then.
As it was when it was a day of rest.
Yeah.
But the same issues would crop up, which is basically what is distinctive. What are we doing? What kinds of things are we not supposed to do? All the same stuff is going to come up. It's just on a different day. I'm reminded of like what I always identified when I was a young teacher in New York. The young professor that Friday, all of us would a lot of us had this, worked in this one really dreadful college out on Long Island. And really talk about authoritarian. Anyway, we would leave campus like drowned rats on Friday and come back to the city. And then in one or another of our houses, we would gather together because we couldn't really just sort of exit to our own homes. We would gather together and somebody would get takeout Chinese and we would light candles and we would do Shabbat together there on Friday night. So Shabbat, in my experience, is always knitted together with takeout Chinese. and yet the spirit was there. It was like, oh, this week is ended. Thank goodness we can think about real things. We can think about how much we love each other and how great our kids are and how happy we are that we have people who take care of us. I mean, that was the spirit of it, and that was fine. It's just take out Chinese, that's all.
Sure. Sorry, I see Shayna's hand.
I just have a question of when Enelo is talking about making Shabbat a genuine religious institution and one of religious edification and putting it in these like positive terms of what it should be as opposed to what it isn't. I understand the argument from his perspective in this cultural context to move it to Sunday. What I don't think I understand is, what does Enelo mean by religious edification? What does he want the people to be like doing or edifying or practicing on that Sunday?
Because he wants them to be in synagogue and listening to some, spiritually uplifting, edifying sermon. He doesn't want them to have the option he doesn't want them to be in their stores, right? He doesn't want them to have to They don't even have the option of opening their stores on Sunday because they can't by law. They can't go to the theater because the theaters are closed. They can't go to a baseball game because there is no baseball. In other words, they don't have the option of engaging in, they don't have the obligation to go to work, and they don't have the option of engaging in American style leisure activities, because society has already taken care of closing off all of those options. And therefore, it can be a genuine day of spiritual rest, right?
Well,
Where there will be, and there's of course no TV and no radio and no internet. So, and no cat videos, and no TikToks. So you can't do any of those things. So it really is going to be a day when your only options are have a nice dinner, have a nice leisurely time, attend your house of worship where the rabbi is going to preach to you at length, and then have a nice dinner with your family and go stroll in the park.
well, that just raises more questions for me because
Yeah.
It's a beautiful answer. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I don't mean to criticize NLO too harshly. He's a very good speaker. These ideas are very clearly expressed. I can see the value of it. But I wonder, is there a tension or even a contradiction between this idea that what we need is, like you said, all of the community together in response to these restrictive laws, and the idea that we will be more united by our faithfulness to an idea than divided by the difference in our practice? I wonder how he would join those two things if he were here.
That's a really good question. And I suspect there that he's getting, that I personally, I think he was flat out wrong. If some Jews were observing Shabbat on Saturday and others were observing on Sunday, that would be a profound difference, right? That would be a profound difference that would ultimately split the community. There is nothing more divisive than having two different calendars, right? But again, this is but he is making an argument, right? That notice my studies have shown me, right? That the real essence of Shabbat is spiritual edification, making making a person more, making you a better person, improving your character, making you more pious, and that all of this abstaining from work and or linking Shabbat either to creation or to the Exodus from Egypt was a fiction. Right? So all of those, in other words, the things that we are accustomed to think of as, what is Shabbat? When you make Kiddush, okay, it's linked both to creation and to the Exodus from Egypt, right? Because if you look at Shemot, Exodus, the reason given there for Shabbat is because in, on 6 days God made heaven and earth, and the seventh day God rested. And then if you open up to the version of the Decalogue in Deuteronomy, you get, in Dvarim, you get, you should rest on Shabbat because you were slaves in the land of Egypt, right? So we now find both of those, and I think it's pretty safe to say, we find those really profound concepts, right? And we don't have to believe that God literally created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh in order to be moved by the idea that there is a difference between toil and rest, right? And that there is something valuable and humane in the, utterly humane in the idea of rest. And we also find it links us to our history, maybe not literally, because historically the Exodus did not happen the way it says in the Torah, but nevertheless, the idea that we were slaves and we were free, and we went from being avadim, slaves, right, to Pharaoh, the phony god, and we became avadim, slaves slash servants slash worshippers to Adonai, the real God, right, is also of profound meaning. And here is a Reform rabbi who is essentially so taken by the intellectual superiority of the outside world, right? That he cannot see any value in either of those two concepts. Right? But we can also see that, there are many, 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 many controversies going in both directions. But here is, where's my red reader?
Here I am.
Go ahead, Susan, take it away.
David Phillipson. The people who think there should be Sunday services or even a Sunday Sabbath have just as much right to their view as those who want us to stay with the historical Sabbath. The CCAR has no right to tell anyone what they should do. I don't see how we can prevent someone from transferring the Sabbath to Sunday if that is what they believe is right. I personally believe in the historical Sabbath, but I am also a believer in personal autonomy.
Okay, so, right, I want it both ways. Okay. I want to do the way I want, but I don't want anybody telling me what to do, and I don't want to tell anybody else what to do. By the way, David Phillipson, 3 years later, a decade later, was going to come down very, very differently on an issue that he felt really strongly about. Okay. The responsive committee got a question from the rabbi in San Francisco whose congregation wanted to have a Torah reading only in English. They wanted to skip the Hebrew altogether, and the rabbi was a little upset about this and brought it to the responsive committee, and it was debated at in the plenum, right, in the full meeting of the conference. And those rabbis who found this really, 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 really upsetting wanted to ban it. The idea, they wanted to say, no, you cannot get rid of the Hebrew altogether, even if you're only reading 3 verses, right? If we get rid of the Hebrew altogether, we're going to become like those Alexandrian Jews who all Hellenized away, and, we lost them all because they didn't know, they didn't even retain any Hebrew whatsoever. And David Phillipson, who here says, I want personal autonomy and I don't want anybody telling me what to do, okay, was one of the people who wanted to ban the English only Torah reading. So, sorry, Betsy.
So my first reaction to reading him, I just have to share this with something my mother used to say. She used to say, your mind's so open, your brains fall out. And that's what kind of reminds me of, okay, we'll do it this way, we'll do it this way. And what do we have in the end? Just, I mean,
Mhm.
I don't have much reaction to that except what my mother used to say.
Yeah. Right. And then so look at the response to him by Wolf Wilner, who you can see I put him in blue because he's coming down with the other folks, right? Um, Here, I'll read it. We are not here just to take a poll of the people. It has always been the duty of the rabbi to decide between right and wrong. We've been asked to do that concerning the Sabbath, so let's decide. Otherwise, we may as well just pack up our suitcases and go home now, right? If we're not going to come up with something, then, it goes back to this issue of authority versus authoritarian, right? We're the rabbis. People are asking us for guidance. We're supposed to be able to tell them something. If we can't tell them something, what's the point? Okay. So what did the CCAR end up doing? They ended up coming out with this really namby-pamby resolution about, okay, we should all try to observe the Sabbath better. Yeah. It's really sort of they had no answer. They didn't have the language or the concepts even, and it wasn't until 60 years later that the that that the Reform Rabbinate collectively started dealing with Shabbat. It came up in 1965 for the first time, and Gunther Plaut came out with a Shabbat manual, and then the CCAR published one in the 80s, and then it's gone on. But over time, we have kind of more, there's a kind of nobody in the reform movement is talking about the Sunday Sabbath anymore, right?
Well, that's partly because it didn't work. I mean, there was no tidal wave of agreement. I mean, there
Mm-hmm.
were significant congregations like Temple Sinai in Chicago
Yeah.
celebrated Shabbat on Sunday, but it was very much more the exception than the rule. It didn't work.
It
Didn't.
it it didn't help anybody. It didn't feel right, right? They tried it and it felt wrong. Yeah, and not enough people bought into it. So instead, they just, sort of it kind the organically, they all decided to stay in the traditional ballpark. And one could argue that we, just like those secular Israelis who are getting together on the pier and, on the pier in Jaffa for Kabbalat Shabbat. Have you heard about that?
Yeah.
Okay, so there are all of these Jews for whom the Orthodox, traditional/Orthodox way of interpreting Shabbat and observing Shabbat no longer works. But something new is being born, right? So in the meantime, though, we have essentially, and I'm going to finish up with a brief observation about the responsive committee, and because I've kept you over time, I know. The responsive committee has come to have two functions. Number one, the traditional function of, okay, we have a new situation, we don't know what to do, let's ask the responsive committee. So for example, physician-assisted dying, or one from a couple of years ago, should we perform a conversion for a woman who is about to be ordained as a UU minister? Uh, so there are, okay, we haven't had this situation before, but we can give you it's narrow, we can give you a pretty definitive answer on it. But in many other ways, questions that the responsive committee gets about, say, Shabbat or burial practices or matters of personal status or other things. We are essentially an ad hoc committee of guidance, okay? The old system, what still works for them, we know does not work for us. We're in the process of being in dialogue with the tradition. And if you ask us right now, in this time and place, what should we do? Here is what our traditional sources have to say about this. Here is what we think they are trying to teach us about how to read Torah. And we're going to balance that with the needs of the day. And we're going to give you an answer in which we are going to try to essentially persuade you that this is a better way to understand our tradition than not. Rabbi Cohen's also on the committee now, right? We're about to issue a tshuva about somebody wanting to know if they can be buried in a pet cemetery. Okay. Not because they have a pet there that they want to be with, but apparently because it's cheaper. Okay. So, okay, technically, a Jew can be buried anywhere, right? Because once you own that plot, that is your private space, and whatever is outside of it is irrelevant, right? We don't have notions of consecrated ground, so forth. But aren't there some other concerns here, right? What does this say about the person? What does this say about their connection to the community? If they really can't afford it, doesn't the community have an obligation to help them? And if it's just that they don't care, don't we have, isn't that sad? Right? And what is that rabbi? Let's say the person insists on being, this is where I'm doing, I don't care what the rabbi says, right? What is that rabbi's obligation in terms of what that rabbi is going to teach the rest of the community? Is that rabbi going to officiate in a pet cemetery? Right. So we are very much, right, we are a movement in process. We are engaged in dialogue with an inherited tradition, right? And we are not claiming that what we decide today is going to be right 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, right? But I do think that 2, 3, 4, 5 generations down the road, just like rabbinic Judaism, didn't spring full blown, as it were, from the forehead of Zeus, like Athena, Lahavdil. But we will find that a new path is being and has been created. So, and I hope this 90 minutes has been worth your time.
I believe it has. Could you take down the screen share, please?
Yeah, let me take away the screen share. Stop share. Okay, there we
First
go.
of all, Joan, Joe, thank you very much. This was very good. So this was very
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you all.
This was wonderful. Yes,
Great.
thank you.
It's really great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a couple of concluding comments,
Yeah.
not about the talk so much. I mean, I made a few comments, and that's as many as I'm going to make. I've been in a situation where I'm presenting, I'm teaching, and I feel that the rabbi whom I'm working with kind of wants to one up me, and I don't want to give that picture image at all. This was very, very, very good and very historically, I don't know, very historically interesting. What I do want to say, first of all, is I want to see, at least for those of you who I see on screen, is there a show of hands for those of you who want to hang and do Ruth? No, it's if you do, just raise your hand. I don't need a lot of people, just a few. Okay, we got enough of a cohort. The other thing I want to say, and Joan, Joan is our last speaker, and you will certainly pay attention to the fact that we brought in. I'll be a little egotistical here. I brought in a number of speakers through the generosity of our oh crap, I'm sorry, crap, sorry using that word. Our what's it called? The van, not what is the fund that we have?
Legacy Committee,
Legacy,
Legacy,
thank you.
Legacy Fund.
Legacy. We brought in somebody to speak about anti-Semitism. I just made this random list. Reform Responsa tonight. History of the Deli. We brought in Eric Sabar from Israel to talk about his experience. We brought in someone to talk about Musar, someone to talk about the Holocaust in terms of Africa. We brought in Ron Cronish. We brought in my friend Chris Layton, who was here for 2 sessions. We brought in Chava Tiro Samuelson to talk about Judaism and environmentalism. So this was a pretty good lecture series, and a lot of you came regularly, and I really appreciate that. And I hope that you enjoyed what these people had to teach with us. They were different speakers, different presenters, different styles, and all extraordinarily edifying. So Joan, thank you very much. You're very good. You're a very good person to be the last of the series because you were really, really good. I thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Boy, I'm honored to be in that list, and Chava Tirosh Samuelson. I'm impressed that you got her to come.
Well, the basic method is these are all FOP for the most part, friends of Phil.
Okay.
I have a friendship with Chava going back several years. Although I think if someone approached her out of the blue to come on Zoom, she probably would do it.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I suggest 10 minutes. So let's make it 8:45 Pacific time, and we'll come back and we'll do Ruth. And we could probably do a respectable study within about an hour. I'll keep it to an hour. Nobody has to stay up all night. And for those of you who are not going to join us for Ruth, keep in mind, Yisker tomorrow at noon, Zoom only. It's a half an hour or less. Please join us. And again, Joan, Toda Rabba Lach and Chag Sameach, and we'll be seeing each other at least through the responsive committee. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Thank you all. Chag Sameach and good night. It's 11:30 and I'm going to sleep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Night.
All right.
Good night.
Night.
So I'm going to take a real 10 minutes. I'm going to bring up the book of Ruth. And those of you who are going to stay, I muted myself while I was talking. We're going to have a very nice time with this book. So 10 minutes.
Should we leave the, no, I don't know, should we leave it on or?
So by my clock, it's 8:44. Wait another minute. And hopefully everybody whose name is up there is also present on the screen. Okay, so the book of Ruth is the Haftarah for Shavuot. Along the way, I'm going to ask you to help me try and figure out why. What's the connection or connections between the holiday of Shavuot and the book of Ruth? Just to quickly remind you, of course, Shavuot is in the calendar year, the third of the pilgrimage festivals. First one being Sukkot, second one Pesach, and the third Shavuot pilgrimage festival, meaning that to observe it, you are expected to come to Jerusalem, to the temple, and make the appropriate sacrifice, depending on which festival you are observing. And it celebrates the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. Of the three pilgrimage festivals in the Torah, it's recognized as being Torahitic, but its sources, its description, is the most obscure of the three. Pesach it's the least obscure. I don't know if I said it right. It's the least obscure of the three. Pesach is the most clear of the three because it's mentioned many times, including before the 10th plague. There's a long description of what Pesach would be. That's one thing. So why do we read Ruth on Shavuot? I'm going to ask you to help me answer that question. Second, two institutions that come into play here that I want to describe so that when we encounter them in the story, you'll know about them. One is one anti-poverty practice that emerges from the Torah is the prohibition against picking up your gleanings, or actually you make gleanings. I guess that's how it works. You do not pick up your gleanings from the ground while you're harvesting whatever crop it is you're harvesting, wheat, barley, or any other crop. And what's left on the ground is to go to the poor. And so in this story, you see an illustration of how that worked. You'll see Ruth being part of the gleaners who pick up what the people picking the crop have dropped on the ground. And this works very interestingly within the plot of the story. The second institution is something called levirate marriage. I've only ever heard of this in terms of Judaism. I don't know if it may well exist in similar forms in other cultures, among other groups. A levirate marriage is like this. Husband dies and he has no children. And he has a brother. Or as you'll see in this story, not necessarily a brother, but some other close relative. In this story, the relationship to Naomi is unclear, but there are at least two people who are called redeemers. That's the literal word in Hebrew, goel. They're called redeemers. And if a man dies without children, then he's got nobody to inherit his property. Because he can't send it to the daughters, although that gets changed a little bit. So the brother, if he's unmarried, is obligated to marry the widow, or at least has the opportunity and the strong suggestion that he marry the widow. And if he refuses to marry the widow, there's a kind of a strange ceremony in which he rejects the woman, and then he's no longer required to marry her, and she's free to find another husband, and the brother is free to marry whoever he chooses. if they get married, then the first child between that marriage, that child is as if he was the son of the deceased father, even though the father had nothing to, the dead man had nothing to do with bringing this child into the world. And there are inheritance issues that go along with this. So I think those are the two things I need to bring out. There's a wonderful saying, there's a wonderful line in the first chapter, which we'll undoubtedly stop and spend a minute on. I'm going to bring up the screen. I have to my left the trusty Alter translation, which I'll undoubtedly like to consult from time to time throughout this study. Feel free. You have a question to raise your hand. Whoop, Joan already has a question. Hold on. Feel free to ask questions, and together we'll look at this story in terms of its themes, character, even the dialogue, its quality as literature, what it has to say about this ancient world, and how it concludes. We look at how it concludes in terms of its messianism. There's a messianism inherent in this story that's rather delicious. Joan?
I wanted to ask a question about the inheritance issue. So if a man was married, I mean, if the man had possessions, the guy who died had possessions, the wife did not inherit any of the possessions?
The wife was supported. I'm sorry, I'm chewing a lifesaver.
That's okay.
The inheritance passed through the husband. And that's as much as I can tell you off the top of my head.
But it was like patrilineal. Any possessions went patrilineal. So the mother would have been left with nothing. The wife would have been left with nothing. Okay.
Yeah, it's in her interest, in that society, it's in her interest too, to marry the brother.
Yeah.
For her own.
Okay. I got it. Now I understand why that thing you just mentioned was done. Okay, thanks.
All right, so let me bring the Book of Ruth up. And I think, as I said before, I think we can do a respectable study and not be here until 11:30 our time. All right, I got to make you disappear. Now, I won't read the Hebrew all the way through, but as you know, if you studied Torah with me, I like to read a little bit of the Hebrew to give the sound of it. Vayhi bimei shvot hashoftim, vayhi ra'av ba'aretz, vayelech ish mibeit lechem Yehuda lagur b'stei Moav, hu v'ishto u'shnei vanav. So this is a story. I'll say right at the beginning. This is a story that is written. I'm trying to see how do I say this. The author is writing a story about what happened a long time ago. This story was not, the author does not purport to be around at the time in which the story takes place. It happens a long time ago, when the chieftains ruled, and there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah and his wife and 2 sons went to reside in the country of Moab. Pretty clear. There's a famine, and they lived in Beit Lechem in Bethlehem, and they go to live in Moab, where there's supposedly more better land for growing crops. And to point out stylistically, and I'm not going to dwell on every stylistic issue here. At first, they're not named. It's just an anonymous husband and wife and their 2 kids. But now they're named. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And his 2 sons were named Machlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. They came to the country of Moab and remained there. So they live okay for a while, apparently. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Okay, the 2 sons could take care of her. They married Moabite women. one named Orpah and the other Ruth, and they lived together there about 10 years. And the Hebrew is the about 10 years reflects the Hebrew accurately. Ke'eser shanim. They lived there for about 10 years. And that's a long time to be married and have no kids. By the way, I learned today from a friend of mine that Oprah, as an Oprah Winfrey, was named after Orpah, but apparently her parents read the wrong Bible. And so her name should be Orpah Winfrey, but it's Oprah Winfrey. But that's really where she got her name from. So Orpah and Ruth married the two boys. And apparently they don't have any kids. Then those two, Machlon and Chilion, died. So the woman was left without her two sons and without her husband. So this, in that world, is a very dire situation for all three women. They're widows without children to support them, and it's just a very, very bad scene. And I would say, given what we understand, given that world, having been married for 10 years, these women are not, they're not in the prime, they're not prime marriageable age anymore. And understand, folks, you probably, I hope you do understand that I'm talking about this, not prescriptively, but descriptively about the way the world was in which this story was written, and the time in which this story purports to be about. So there's this kind of anonymity here that I find interesting. She started out with her two daughters-in-law to return to the country of Moab, from the country of Moab, sorry. For in the country of Moab, she had heard that the Lord had taken note of his people and given them food. So the famine was over back in the old country, and she's on her way back because at least there's food there. And probably what else? There's her people. And now we're going to learn, actually, as the story progresses, it's not just her people like her fellow Jews, but there really are people of hers back there. And that becomes one of the pivots in the plot of the story. So what happens? So accompanied by her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living, and they set out to the road back to the land of Judah, Yehudah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, and this is very peculiar what she's about to say, "Turn back, each of you, to her mother's house. May God deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." And I don't really like it when there are exclamation points in the English, because it's not in the Hebrew, it's really the translator's interpretation. "May the Lord grant that each of you find security in the house of a husband." And she kissed them farewell, and they broke into weeping. And I think that the context here assures us that this weeping is genuine on the part of all three women. And said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Turn back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I any more sons in my body who might be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight and I also bore sons, should you wait for them to grow up? Should you on their account debar yourselves from marriage? Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Lord has struck out against me." I'm going to take down the screen share. And I'm interested in your reaction. I'm interested in your reaction to this bit of reasoning on Naomi's part. Who am I? I can't get married and have two more sons for you to marry. And even if so, the age difference initially is going to be so large, you can't wait that long for them to be old enough to be a reasonable marriageable age. How does that grab you? How does that grab you, Shayna?
So I will try not to talk forever. This is one of my favorite books. I'm already crying a little bit. It's just really beautiful. But just to be brief, what really stands out to me about it is that this is also, you were right to point out in the beginning that the characters were nameless and then they were named. I think that's a very significant transition. This marks a second transition from having no dialogue, no voice to the characters to being the first bits of dialogue. And what's interesting is that even though it is a woman speaking, it is almost entirely patriarchal, with the assumption that it is with bearing sons and with having a husband that will provide security. And that's just such a really interesting point to start the story off with. Obviously, in the cultural context as well, that was accurate. But how we read it in a modern context too raises room for additional questions. Oh, you're muted.
You're on mute, Rabbi.
Damn. Any more comments at this point? Betsy,
I
anybody else?
have one.
Yeah,
I think it's
Betsy and then-
very unselfish of her. It shows that she is looking out for those girls.
I'm sorry, you said unselfish? I missed-
Unselfish.
I didn't hear the I wasn't sure.
Unselfish, yes.
Well, I think that's right. I think
He's
it's-
concerned with their welfare and their finding another husband in that.
And you stay here, you're a Moabites, and if you're going to find another husband and have a family, this is where it's going to happen. Okay, Betsy?
Well, it strikes such a different tone as so many other parts of the Torah or, the rest of the Bible, in that you don't often hear a lot of emotion coming forward. And this is a very emotional story, and maybe in part because it's this, the focus is on the women and their connections to each other and their relationships over these years. And it's just striking to me that that there's really a lot of emotion shown here, which is pretty unusual.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's something I point out a lot, that the Bible does not frequently describe real emotion. You have to kind of derive it from whatever the image, whatever the story is telling you, without really trying to get a little bit on the inside. All right.
It also shows that there was in the past an excellent relationship between the mother-in-law and her daughter-in-laws, which is contrary to much of our, well, it seems to be, I don't think it's really true, mother-in-laws and daughter-in-laws.
Yeah, okay. We'll pick up. So they broke into weeping again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law farewell, but Ruth clung to her. And so this is going to differentiate Orpah from Ruth. And I don't know that Orpah needs a lot of defense, but I think that this decision, because as Betsy said, there's very strong emotion evinced here that Orpah's decision, the author has it that Orpah's decision is a very difficult one to make. But Ruth, she said, see, she being Naomi, see to your sister, see, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. Go follow your sister-in-law. And now so the word gods, of course, is really telling. Go and follow your sister-in-law. It's okay, worship your gods and remarry. But Tome Ruth, Al tifki'ivi l'ozveich l'shuv me'acharayach, ki el asher telchi elech u'v'asher talini alin ve'amech ami ve'elohayich Elohai. Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. God being the very end of this, but obviously intended to echo what Naomi said to both of them, to her with regard to following Orpah. And of course, you all must know that this is the classic conversion statement, and it's often cited, often used at the moment of conversion. Wherever you go, where I will go, I will. Where you go, I go. Where you stay, I stay. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. So I got to stop and ask if, I mean, it's just such a beautiful statement and so telling in so many ways. Any comments?
As you said, it's beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm come Shabbat this week for conversion, confirmation. I'm going to drash on this a little bit. So this is a real statement of loyalty, a real statement of loyalty to Naomi, to her mother-in-law. I'm going to throw my fate with your fate, and whatever happens, I may not remarry, I may not have kids, I may not have a family, but I want to go with you. You know, and your fate is my fate. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Eternal do for me, if anything but death parts me from you. When Naomi saw how determined she was to go with her, she ceased to argue with her. And what does that tell you? What is the author telling you here? She Naomi, as was pointed out, really wants the best for Ruth. And the best for Ruth in Naomi's judgment is to stay where she is. But this woman really wants to go with me. And so it's like acquiescing. It's not compelling Ruth to go with her. She's acquiescing. Okay, then come with me, and we'll see what the fates, that is to say, Adonai, we'll see what God has planned for us. And the two went on until they reached Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole city buzzed with excitement over them. The women said, "Can this be Naomi?" But then Naomi, in a very nice play on words here, Vatomer alehen al tikra'eni Naomi, korali Mara, ki hamar shadai li ma'od. Don't call me Naomi, she replied. Call me Mara, which means bitter, as in maror from Pesach. You know that word from Pesach. For Shaddai has made my lot very bitter. And so she's what is she doing actually? She's in a bad way. I mean, her condition, you might say, is ameliorated to some extent by the fact that her daughter-in-law is with her, so she's not totally miserable. But God has made me miserable. This is, I'm looking up. This is Tevye looking up. God, you did this to me, and so don't call me Naomi. Don't call me Naomi, beautiful. Call me bitter. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. How can you call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, when Shaddai has brought misfortune upon me? Shaddai was one of the names of God, often translated as God Almighty, but very rarely used. It's interesting that the author chooses to use that word here. Thus Naomi returned to the country of Moab. She returned with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabite. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. What festival is the barley harvest associated with? If I'm not mistaken, it's Pesach. It's the first harvest of the season. Now, and note that the text will consistently refer to Ruth as Ruth the Moabite, constantly reminding the reader that she's a foreigner. She comes from Moab. And as the story develops, it's a kind of, maybe the word irony works here. It's kind of ironic because she really, well, I'm not going to give her the story anyway, in case it's the first time you're reading it. So that's chapter 1. That's the whole story. The family leaves. The family has misfortune. 10 years go by. I see your hand, Wendy. I'll give it to you. Call you in a second. And now the men all die, and 2 of the 3 women. Naomi returns with one of the 2 Moabite women, and that's Ruth. Wendy.
I'm wondering if they say a lot that she's the Moabite, because if I remember correctly, there's a prohibition. I don't remember if it was Exodus or later, where you're not supposed to marry Moabites.
Yeah, I don't, that's, yeah, that's ringing a bell. I don't know, I can't answer that, but it's a good point. But I think it's probably I think it's probably being used in a different kind of way, and not to contradict you, because you may have a point there, but it's to remind us, maybe even so, that she's not only a foreigner, but in terms of your comment, she's a foreigner whose presence we're not necessarily we don't necessarily approve of. Betsy?
I just wanted to say that it's not, I think I'm interested in the name change for Naomi, that she doesn't, she feels she should be called something else. And I think it's not just that these things have happened, but that she is a different person than when she left. She's a different person, having gone away, experienced life, had a husband and sons, knows what loss is, has a daughter-in-law who loves her and is willing to be a foreigner. That the name signifies she is not the same woman she was when she left.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. She's different and not better, at least at this point. At least at this point in the story. Okay. So chapter 2. Now, here's where that issue of Levirate marriage comes in. Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a man of substance, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So, now the background music becomes upbeat. We hear about Boaz. We don't know anything. We don't know necessarily. You have to assume. There was some Russian playwright. I can't remember who it was, but he was famous for saying, if a gun appears in the first act, you damn well better use it before the play is over.
Chekhov.
Who was it?
Chekhov.
I was going to say Chekhov, but I wasn't sure. Okay, it was Chekhov who said that. So we don't know anything about Boaz except that he has some kind of relationship on Elimelech's side. We don't know how remote that relationship is, but it's a relationship, and that's going to factor into the story, like I say, with regard to the Levirate marriage issue. But if we're going to hear about Boaz and he's a man, he damn well better, even if you don't know the way the story's going, he damn well better marry Ruth before the story's over, or this just isn't going to work. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, I would like to go to the fields and glean among the ears of grain behind someone who may show me kindness. Yes, daughter, go. So, as I said earlier, this is a safety net in Israelite culture. Somehow Ruth knows about it. Maybe Naomi tells her. I mean, we don't know how she knows about it, but she knows about it, and it is a way of survival, but it's also an act of desperation. I mean, how much grain can you really pick up after the reapers have gotten the most of it? And she says, Lechi biti, calling her daughter, not daughter-in-law, but her daughter. And off she went. She came and gleaned in a field behind the reapers, and as luck would have it, it was a piece of land belonging to Boaz. Oh my God, what a surprise. It was a piece of land belonging to Boaz, who was of Elimelech's family, to remind us again. Presently, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, and he greeted the reapers. God be with you, he says. And they responded, God bless you. And just for your information, the Hebrew is Yivarechecha Adonai, which if you ever come to services on a Friday night, you know this is the first part of the priestly benediction. The reapers respond, Yivarechecha Adonai. So, at the risk of, I want to be finished with this book and do a respectable job of it. But what does that tell you? And this I think, at least in my reading, is really, really intelligent on the part of the writer. What does that little greeting back and forth tell you about Boaz? What can you see about Boaz?
Well, someone who has, a conversation with, the help, as it were, who doesn't need to, is generally somebody who has a good sense of humility and understands that it's not all about them and their wealth, that their wealth comes in part from the labor of the people who work from them. And, you can generally tell a lot about a person, the people in the office who thank the people who take out their trash. Those are the people, generally have been brought up pretty well. And it just says something about you.
What else? That I think catches Boaz accurately, but they respond to him. Yevarechecha Adonai. It's not, howdy, or how you doing, or hi. It's Yevarechecha Adonai. What does that tell you about the reapers?
They have a lot of esteem for Boaz. They
Yeah,
respect him.
yeah. You could say, you could speculate, if you're a real cynic, that that he's their employer, and they ought to say something nice to him. But I think choosing those words, that known formula, says they like this guy, they respect
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
So there's a real relationship between him as their employer and them as the employees, that has a degree of a large degree of respectability to it. So that's how he enters the scene, and that's we now know two things about him. He's a nice guy, and probably more than just a nice guy, and he's got a relationship to Elimelech.
And he's rich.
Oh, and he's rich. Yeah. Can't forget that. He's rich. Boaz said to the servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose girl is that?" So you got to fill in the blank, right? He's looking around at the reapers, and he sees at the very end this very comely young lady. It catches his eye. "Whose girl is that?" The servant in charge of the reapers replied, "She is a Moabite girl who came back from Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. And she's been on her feet ever since she came in this morning. She has rested but little in the hut," by which you can presume that there's some kind of place you go and take a coffee break or have a cigarette. Boaz, so now, what do we know about Ruth? What does that little bit tell us about Ruth?
She's very industrious.
Yeah, this is her first day on the job, and she doesn't have calluses on her feet yet, but she's industrious. She's working hard. She knows that she's working for both her and for Naomi. And she's got to get as much out of this as she can. And she caught his eye. So 10 years past being optimum marriage age, she's still quite good looking.
And, remember too, that she is a stranger here.
Yeah.
So she's trying to fit in, I would think, trying to make a good impression. I don't know that she has her eye set for Boaz yet, but she's trying to fit in, trying to become at home in this new country.
So Boaz says to Ruth, "Listen to me, daughter." And I just want to make sure, he too uses the term BT, which may indicate he's a little on the older side. I think it probably does. "Don't go to glean in another field. Don't go elsewhere, but stay here close to my girls." Na'arotai, the young women who work in the field. So
this doesn't mean his daughters, right? These are
right.
women. Okay.
And the word isn't daughter, it's na'arotai, the young women. You got a job, you don't have to worry about it. I'm granting you at least a modicum of security. "Keep your eyes on the field they are reaping and follow them. I've ordered." Now, here's an interesting phrase.
Yes.
I'd be interested in your reaction in particular. "I've ordered the men not to molest you. And when you are thirsty, go to the jars and drink some of the water that the men have drawn." Now, I want to check what Alter has to say about this, how he translates that word, because I'm a little suspicious.
Molest means bother
Well, that's why.
in this context.
It
My
could.
translation has harass, so I don't know if that is what
Right.
other
The
people have.
author says, let's see. Alter turns this into a question. Have I not charged the lads not to touch you? So I think, I suspect the translation choice of molest was too strong a word here. We've seen two other translations that have a softer meaning, but at least
Right.
not to bother you. I mean, I've told the men not to bother you.
Bother you, yeah.
And when you're thirsty, go, don't hesitate to go, none of this business about going infrequently to get some water. It's hard work, drink as you need it. She prostrated herself with her face to the ground and said to him, why are you so kind as to single me out when I am a foreigner? V'anochi nochriya, it's a perfect translation. And Boaz said, I've been told of all that you did for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and the land of your birth and came to a people you had not known before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and you have a full recompense from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have sought refuge. So that's now we don't know how he learned that. Maybe as the servant says, that's the Moabite, and he says, oh yeah, I remember hearing about this. We don't know how he learned it, doesn't matter. And even if it's a bit of a suspension of disbelief, it's fiction. But he's saying, I know what a kind person you are, that you came back with Naomi when you didn't have to. And so I'm at this point, my main interest is to be kind back to you and to help you and Naomi get back up on your feet. And he invokes God's blessing. She answered, you are most kind, my lord, to comfort me and to speak gently to your maidservant, though I am not so much as one of your maidservants. And so, of course, I won't take down the screen share. What do we learn about Ruth from this? She herself has a good deal of humility. She's feeling the kindness from somebody who's taking care of her, even though she's a foreigner. She's a Moabite. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here and partake of the meal and dip your morsel in the vinegar. So she sat down beside the reapers. He handed her roasted grain and she ate her fill and had some left over. And note that, had some left over.
Mm.
And while dipping, I don't know what the morsel is. Let me see the Hebrew here. I want to see how Walter translates that. If he's more specific. Okay, he translates it as crust. So all I'm thinking, I've never heard of dipping bread into vinegar as something I care to eat, but there you have it. Somebody wanted to say something?
It's Joan. A lot of people put vinegar on everything they eat. They use it like instead of salt.
Yeah, come to think of it, the British put vinegar on their French fries. Now
That's right.
Yeah, all right. Just doesn't appeal. But the point is, he come over here and you and I will have the same lunch.
Yeah.
You're on an equal footing with me as far as break time goes, and I'm taking care of you in the field. In the space of however many hours, but not even a full work day. Ruth's situation, and by including, I'm sorry, I'm having word finding troubles. It's too late for me to be teaching. By Naomi too, and within one working day, within less than one working day, their situation has changed for the better quite drastically. When she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his workers. You are not only to let her glean among the sheaves without interference, but you must also pull some stalks out of the heaps and leave them for her to glean and not scold her. So now it's not just the pickings from the ground. It's suddenly she's got big piles of barley in front of her to pick up. And you'll see in a moment just how generous this is. She gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned. It was about an ephah. Don't ask me what an ephah is, but it's a lot. An ephah of barley, and carried it back with her to the town. When her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and when she also took out and gave her what was left over after eating her fill, her mother-in-law asked, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be he who took such generous notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law whom she had worked with, saying, "The name of the man whom I worked with today is Boaz." Boom, 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 lights, fireworks go off in the background, and Naomi's eyes open as large as saucers because she knows who this dude is. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he of the eternal God who has not failed in God's kindness to the living or the dead." For, Naomi explained to her daughter-in-law, "the man is related to us. He is one of our redeeming kinsmen." So now we know he's not only a kinsman, which is the only way he's been identified up until now, but he's a redeeming kinsman, which means he may have some degree of obligation actually to marry this woman. Although this is not an exact parallel to the way this law has been described, I believe, in the book of Leviticus. I'm not, or maybe it's probably Exodus actually. This is a little different because this is a remoter relationship than brothers, but still this law seems to be in effect here. And Naomi is a Moabite, and yet in this one verse we see what's happening. I mean, we can already pretty much guess what's going to happen, and the rest is all following how it unfolds. But apparently, by identifying this way, Naomi, has the opportunity to remind Boaz one way or another of his obligation to marry her, or at least bring it up, to raise it as a possibility. Ruth the Moabite again said, "He even told me, 'Stay close by my workers until all my harvest is finished.'" And Naomi answered her daughter-in-law Ruth, "It is," and now not the Moabite, "it is best, daughter, that you go out with his girls and not be annoyed in some other field." Well, yeah, no kidding. So she stayed close to the maidservants of Boaz and gleaned until the barley harvest and then the wheat harvest were finished. That's a long time. That's 7 weeks if I got this straight in my head. She stayed at home with her mother-in-law. This whole 7 weeks, she's harvesting, and they're doing well. She's got more to pick than other gleaners have, and they're comfortable. Comfortably upper lower class or lower middle class, but they're not impoverished anymore, and they're not worried about their fates. And I would bet if this writer wanted to be more talkative, Naomi would no longer be telling people to call her Mara. Her fate at this point has much improved, though it's got a ways to go. I'm going to take the screen share down and just ask any comments or questions.
So I have a question. It's Joan again.
Wait. I was about to bring the screen share up again. Okay, go ahead, please.
I have a question. So Ruth is a Moabite, right?
Right.
So she's a daughter-in-law of Naomi. Naomi is from Bethlehem, but they went to Moab, right?
Right.
So does the Levirate, to a daughter-in-law, I can understand how Naomi would be the person that Boaz would be obligated to marry, but the daughter-in-law?
It's a little strange, and if I've read commentaries about this, I didn't recently in my preparation for tonight. So it seems to me that the author is stretching matters, as you're identifying. I think the author is stretching matters. I don't really think although as the story proceeds, and as you'll see, the author sees this as a legal obligation on the part of the redeemers, even though it's a little strange. Although her husband, Ruth's husband, was of course Elimelech's son. Let me play this out a little bit. So even though Ruth is not a citizen, the redeemer still has an obligation. Let's say it would be much clearer if the son, and we don't know which of the sons married which woman. It would be clearer if the widow was an Israelite, was from Judah. So I think that the author is stretching this, and it makes a very interesting point already about how Ruth the Moabite becomes Ruth the Jew. We know she's become a Jew already at the end of the first chapter because, your people are my people, your God is my God. So she has already converted, so to say, although not in a formal way. But again, I believe as you're asking, Joan, it is stretching matters. It's stretching matters to make who Ruth becomes, or what Ruth becomes, or what Ruth's progeny become, a really interesting matter. Shana, you're remarkably silent given what you said you were going to be.
Oh, I created false expectations. I just didn't sleep very well last night, and the sleepiness hit me. So I might be a bit passive, but I'm still listening.
Okay, all right. Betsy.
Well, a levirate marriage, I thought it wouldn't apply to Naomi because she'd had children, even though
children. That's right. That's right.
even though they died.
Okay.
You had to not have any children.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks for
She
pointing
was
out.
also an older lady and she wasn't as pretty as the daughter-in-law.
Right, well, that's but given her,
Well, I guess it also had to do with the fact, that it's the next generation who needs husbands to have children also, to not only for financial security, but to have children to, keep the population going. And, and that would not have applied to Naomi at that point.
It does say Peru or Revu in the first book, in the first chapter of Genesis, be fruitful and multiply. But my guess is we're primarily talking about progeny for the sake of inheritance, and then secondarily to keep the lineage going.
How many generations before David is born? How long is that period?
I don't think we know, but you're giving away the punchline. This is all. Giving away the punchline. That's but I don't think we know from this story.
Sorry.
No. It's totally okay. Totally okay. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her daughter, "I must seek a home for you where you may be happy. Time has passed, and now things are going to get set up. Now there is our kinsman Boaz, whose girls you were close to. He will be winnowing the barley on the threshing floor tonight. We're going to barley into grain. So bathe, anoint yourself, dress up, go down to the threshing floor. Do not disclose yourself to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he lies down and go over and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what you are to do."
Ooh.
This is the Bible, folks, but let's be clear, the Bible. So she replied, "I will do everything you tell me." Now, this is a period of time that's passed, not clear how long, but probably a couple months, few months. And Ruth is now familiar, and people are familiar with her, and she's familiar with Boaz. We don't know how many times she and Boaz have had lunch, with the dipping of the crust in the vinegar, and so on. But go down and watch him hide from him on the threshing floor. Wait till he eats and drinks and lies down. Sandy, what's on your mind?
When it says when he uncover his feet, are they really saying uncover his private parts? Because I heard one time that that's what that meant.
Let's go through this and then speculate. And I may have a look at altar, but let's we only just got we got a few more verses to go, and then we can raise the question again. It is, to be clear, the obvious question. She went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. Boaz ate and drank, and in a cheerful mood he went to lie down beside the grain pile. And she went over stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. In the middle of the night, the man gave a start and pulled back. There was a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. And she replied, I am your handmaid Ruth. Spread your robe over your handmaid, for you are a redeeming kinsman. He exclaimed, Blessed of the Lord, daughter, your latest deed of loyalty is greater than the first, in that you have not turned to younger men, whether poor or rich, because Boaz knows there's another redeemer, another person who could be a possible redeemer. Now, daughter, have no fear. I will do in your behalf whatever you ask, for all the elders of my town know what a fine woman you are. And while it is true that I am a redeeming kinsman, there is another redeemer closer than I. Stay for the night, then in the morning, if he will act as a redeemer, good, let him redeem. But if he does not want to act as a redeemer for you, I will do so myself, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning. So while it's clear, I think, from the point of view of the author and from Ruth and Naomi and probably the reader as well, the preferred redeemer is Boaz. All of a sudden, Ruth has two marriage possibilities, whereas the day before she was 10 years too old to get remarried. She's got two marriage possibilities. And note that Boaz says, I'm so, I know that I'm older than you. Baruch Hashem, you've shown favor to me. So she laid on his feet until dawn. She rose before one person could distinguish another before its light, for he thought, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Hold out your shawl you are wearing, he said. She held it while he measured out 6 measures of barley, and he put it on her back. When she got back to town, she came to her mother-in-law, who asked, how is it with you, daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her. And she added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying to me, do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. I'm going to read one more verse, then I'm going to ask the question. Stay here, daughter, till you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. Now, the question is, is this all code for they had sex, or is it not? I mean, one possibility is, he says, you got to leave before people will see who you are. We don't want people talking. But what was it, a sexual encounter, or was it a measure of intimacy that did not involve sex, did not include sex, and doesn't matter? Sandy,
Oh, no, I just forgot to put it down.
Or does it matter?
Well, I would say no, just because he's thinking that there's another man who he plans to ask first if he's going to take her as a wife, and he seems to be the sort of person who would not dishonor his relative by, sleeping with this woman first and then passing her to him. I don't think he's the sort who would take that action.
Wendy?
I think that whether or not they were physical or not is pointless. I think that when you read it, it's obviously this is a love affair, and Boaz wants to marry Ruth, but he needs to make sure it's on the up and up. And if there's a closer redeeming kinsman, he needs to clear it with him first. But this seems to be what Boaz really wants.
Let's see, Shayna.
It's absolutely sexual. It's extremely sexual. It's one of the most sexual biblical passages. But that's all. Thank you.
Well, you need to, it's entirely possible, but you need to defend your claim.
Oh, okay, I'll try. I'm having a slight headache. Yes, it's absolutely sexual.
Why do you say that, Jana?
I think that a lot of the sexuality is implied in it, but the implications don't make it not present. What stood out to me the most as being distinctly sexual, and I am struggling just a little bit here, so bear with me, is firstly the manner that the whole thing is introduced to this, the sort of the bathe and dress yourself and then wait for him to approach. And secondly, the uncovering of the feet. I do not have the references on hand, but while we cannot say for certain the author's intentions, feet are, they're a little bit phallic sometimes. They certainly can be. And thirdly, when we have that back and forth, I don't see the screen share right now, so it's not in front of me. But there seems to be some dialogue of Boaz, acquiescing or agreeing, or Ruth agreeing that yes, he is to be the redeemer, and that's very clear establishment of consent. And fourthly, that she stays there the whole night. Don't really need to elaborate on that part. So I'm not saying that they necessarily did something that would specifically result in a pregnancy or anything like that. But is this a description of physical intimacy? Yes.
And he does gifts her at the end, right?
Yeah.
Yes, also that.
Betsy?
I think I guess I agree with both ends, really. I don't think that, this is what we've seen is a relationship that has been growing over time. So it doesn't surprise me that it's come to this. And Ruth was very close to Naomi. It seems to me they've clearly discussed this. They've clearly come to the conclusion that this is the guy, and Ruth feels strongly about him. And so I think it's all kind of calculated too, that tonight she's, there's a plan set forward here. I don't think Ruth has any problem going along with the plan. I think this is the guy she wants. And I think that there probably is, some real chemistry between the two of them. But I think they're also both very righteous people, and they will do the right thing, which is there's another guy that has to be brought into this. And if there was a pregnancy, that would be a problem. So I think there's a real relationship here with intimacy, but it's also being handled in the right way. And so when they are together, it will be done right. It will be something the whole community can be behind, and these two people will have their happy ending.
Oh, you don't want to use the phrase happy ending.
Is it not a happy ending?
That's a euphemism when you're getting a massage.
Well, I think they will get their happy ending. I do think they will. That's what I'm saying. I think that they do care for each other, and I think they will, but I don't really think they have it tonight.
And I don't think that's prohibited in the Torah.
Harvey, what's on your mind?
I'm just wondering, how much is virginity at this time important in terms of marriage?
She was already married, wasn't she, previously?
Was she married? Okay, she was private. Okay, so that wouldn't make a difference at this point.
The case you have here is a situation of a somewhat older woman and a man older than he is. So he's so virginity is not at stake here. I will say, though, that doesn't mean he's right, that Alter thinks that what's going on here is the lying at her feet is he says he doesn't think that. Sometimes some interpreters thinks feet is a euphemism for penis. He disagrees, but he doesn't explain why. He just says it's dubious, and that lying at his feet is an indication of in terms of that society, her lower social status. But Shana, that doesn't mean he's right and you're wrong. I'm throwing in Alter's view on the matter. All right, so I'm looking at the clock. I want us to finish this story because it's such a ripping good yarn, and I love the ending. I love the ending. All right. So meanwhile, Boaz had gone to the gate and sat down there. And now the Redeemer whom Boaz had mentioned passed by. He just happened to be passing by. And he's got no name, this Redeemer. So far, he's already, I mean, he's been mentioned, I guess, once, now twice. He meaning Boaz, come here and sit down, so-and-so. And the Hebrew is Ploni Almoni. And that phrase, by the way, it gets picked up and used in Jewish legal language. When you're talking about a case of this or that, and you want to say so-and-so, it's always Ploni Almoni. So then Boaz, so he came and he sat down. Boaz took 10 elders of the town and said, be seated here. And they sat down. So you got 10 elders, meaning they have some authority in the world, but they also know who Ruth is. That may not matter here. He said to the Redeemer, Naomi, now returned from the country of Moab, must sell the piece of land which belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. This is the first mention of property, but okay, it makes sense. He had some property he left behind. So who's going to get the property? So now it's just not a matter of marriage, or at least in terms of the way it's being expressed to this unnamed Redeemer. It's not just the woman, but property comes along with the marriage. I thought I should disclose the matter to you and say, acquire it in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you are willing to redeem it, redeem. But if you will not redeem, tell me that I may know. For there is no one to redeem but you, and I come after you. I'm willing to redeem it. I, Boaz, am willing to redeem it, he replied. Boaz continued, wait a second, no, I beg your pardon, I misread that. That's the Redeemer. Yeah. Boaz continued, when you acquire the property from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabite, you must acquire also the wife of the deceased, and so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate. This gets back to what Betsy said. Oops, there's a woman involved. The Redeemer replied, whoa, hold on there, hold your horses. Then I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own estate, which may mean he's married. When it was just a couple of acres of property, that's fine. I'm willing to take it. I'm happy. Give me the papers. But now you take over my right of redemption, for I am unable to exercise it. Now this was formally done in Israel in cases of redemption or exchange. To validate any transaction, one man would take off his sandal and hand it to the other. Such was the practice in Israel. And as it evolved, by the way, when the rabbis got a hold of it, not only was the Redeemer who refused to be a Redeemer handed a sandal, but he had to spit in it as well. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, acquire for yourself, he drew off his sandal. And Boaz said to the elders and to the rest of the people, you are witnesses today that I am acquiring from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Machlon. I am also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Machlon, as my wife, so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate, that the name of the deceased may not disappear from among his kinsmen and from the gate of his hometown. You are witnesses today. I'm going to read this and then I'm going to stop and ask a question or I'm going to ask you for your observations here. All the people at the gate and the elders said, yes, we are. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built up the house of Israel, prosper in Ephratah and perpetuate your name in Beit Lechem. And may your house be like the house of Peretz, whom Tamar bore Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. Okay, so in case you're not familiar, and this, if I didn't feel the pressure of the hour, I would talk about this a little bit more. But when Joseph gets sold into slavery by his brothers, there's this break in the story, and the focus turns to Judah, the brother Judah. And he has a son, and the son marries this woman Tamar, and the son dies. And so the next son, Onan, marries, and Onan, no, sorry, it's another son. Let me get this right, because and Onan doesn't want to have happened. The text said that God killed the son. So Onan doesn't want to have happen to him what happened to his brother. So he masturbates, and God kills him anyway. And so Tamar is left without a husband. And that's where we get the phrase onanism, which I don't see applied anywhere anymore. It's a word for masturbation. So Judah has a third son, and Judah refuses to give the son to Tamar because she's the kiss of death. Apparently, supposedly, literally the kiss of death. So I'm telling the story anyway because I can't slow this down. So Tamar's waiting and waiting and waiting, and she sends a note, if my memory is correct, to Judah, when am I going to marry this guy? And Judah doesn't let it happen. So Tamar hears that. So Judah and a friend are going up to worship someplace, and Tamar hears this, and she dresses up as a prostitute, and Judah comes along and hires her, and has no money to pay her. So instead, he gives her I believe it's either a staff or a signet ring, but something that identifies Judah as Judah. And he goes off and worships, and Tamar gets pregnant, and Judah, who apparently is the big mahaf in the neighborhood, says, "How dare she play the harlot? I'm going to go execute her." And she goes to Tamar, and Tamar says, "Whose is this?" Oh, the cord and ring. Thank you, Jason. I can always count on Jason. The cord and ring, but whatever. It's uniquely Judah's, and Judah goes, yeah, well, and he realizes all that's happened. That this is Tamar's way in that society. I always have to say in that society to acquire justice, to get justice, and so she's not executed. She has twins. And I'm seeing the text names them. And so one of the son, maybe it's one son, it's Peretz, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. So not only does Judah realize that Tamar's act was an act of justice, of finding and seeking and acquiring justice, but it's obviously part of the tradition now. May you be like Tamar, who played the harlot, and have kids. So Boaz married Ruth. She became his wife, and he cohabited with her. Now they had sex. The Lord let her conceive, and she bore a son. And the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not withheld a redeemer from you today. May his name be perpetuated in Israel. He will renew your life." Now, the redeemer is the kid. The kid now has some greater relationship to Naomi. And look at how this develops. He will renew your life, you Naomi, and sustain your old age, you Naomi, for he is born of your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons. Naomi took the child and held it to her bosom. She became its foster mother, his foster mother. And the women neighbors gave him a name, saying, "A son is born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Okay, so now, Ruth, you see the answer to your question, right? 1 generation or 2 generations from David. This is the line of Peretz. Peretz begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Aminadab. Aminadab begot Nachshon. Nachshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz. Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse. Jesse begot David. And from whom comes the line of David? Who comes from the line of David?
Mashiach.
Messiah.
Yeah.
The Messiah comes to us by way of a Moabite, by way of a Moabite. And that is the end of the story. Naomi, they live happily ever after. Naomi acquires as if a son. Ruth becomes happily married to a wealthy guy, and it's a great little story, but it's a story with theological ramifications, and it's a theological story with theological ramifications that ties Tamar and Judah to Ruth and Boaz. Joan?
Let's see what my did Boaz have other wives?
I don't think so. I think,
But why did he not? He was an older guy.
He was too busy building up his farm and too busy getting degrees in agriculture.
Oh, they left that part out of the story.
That's, those of you who've been studying with me all year know what I'm going to tell Joan.
What?
And Joan's not quite retired yet. She pretends she's retired, but she's not really retired. When you really retire, that's the midrash you write. Boaz's backstory. We don't know Boaz's backstory except that he's got money. That's all we know.
Okay.
Bessie?
I just have a question, because I've always, recognized this idea that Ruth is the grandmother of David and, as you pointed out, linked to the Messiah. But why does the text say, why does the text go to the trouble to say that Naomi became its foster mother?
Yes.
And then the neighbors go so far as to say a son is born to Naomi.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're negating that Ruth is the mother. Like, is there some discomfort with the text about really that the Messiah is going to come from a convert or from a foreigner? Like, why does it so specifically say a son is born to Naomi?
Well, maybe they just say, how grandmas take care of their grandkids a lot. The mamas are busy. Maybe it's that kind of a comment.
I think the implication,
go ahead.
But Shayna and then Wendy, we'll see what they have to say.
Well, I don't mean for this to be the final or the absolute answer, but the implication in my mind, and I can elaborate on this if people have questions about it, I'm sure that some of you will, the implication is that Ruth and Naomi also have their own relationship that in some ways is similar to a husband and wife relationship, and is a little bit gay.
That occurred to me too, Shayna.
It's very apparent in the text.
Well, now that you bring it up, it's a possibility. There's a lot of characterization of David and Jonathan that having a homoerotic relationship. But other than the fact, are you suggesting that the way the story ends is the way the author tells us about that?
That is a very interesting question. I think that the answer to that is that historically queer narratives exist within the sidelines of other narratives. So the author's intent I could not possibly comment on. There's almost certainly another explanation for why a son is born to Naomi is the text there. But when you look at the text in its full context, including the words from Ruth to Naomi, which do really sound like wedding vows, it's chapter 1 and 2 in the top there, they really do. And the like property line and the discussions of ownership of wives that occurs between Boaz and the elders, I think that is not a highlight that would stand out to everyone, but a low light that exists, adding nuance in this sort of triangle of intimacy.
Interesting. It's interesting. Wendy?
I had a different take on the ending with Naomi being the foster mother. I kind of read it as the author trying to create a full circle where Naomi starts out with a family, the family is taken from her, and that's why she's bitter. Her family is gone. She has nobody and no family. And now at the end of the story, she has a family again.
That's, yeah. Joan, is your hand up again, or is this?
Yes, it is. I just want to say, what is the word in Hebrew for foster mother?
Yeah, I gotta look it up. Give me a second. And then I'm also gonna look and see how Alter translates it. Let me find it. Okay, so Vatikach Naomi et hayeled va tishitehu v'cheka, took her to her bosom, held her to her bosom, vatehilo omenet. Now the problem is it's a word I'm not familiar with. So let's see how Dr. Alter translates it. Give me a second. And Naomi took the child and placed him in her lap and became a nurse to him. Now let's see if he's got a commentary. So he says, to cuddle the child and become a caregiver for him is, of course, a natural expression of a grandmother's love, but it is also strongly suggested how the child has become a vivid replacement for the two sons Naomi lost. It is by no means necessary to see this act, as some interpreters have done, as formal ceremony of adoption, and it would be both odd and unnerving for a grandmother to adopt a grandchild while the mother was alive. So I find myself wondering, Alter's translation is later than this one, the JPS translation, and I'm wondering what he has in front of him. He certainly has this translation, but there must be a tradition that the word omenet means foster mother, that Alter is commenting on. But he's just opining. It's just his opinion. It's his strong opinion, and it is, after all, Alter, which you must, if you don't know, he's incredibly respectable and great translator, great master of English and Hebrew, and a great literary critic. He's all of those things wrapped up into one. So his interpretation is he's saying she took the baby, put him in his lap. There's nothing formal about it, and to call her a foster mother is a misinterpretation of the situation. That's what he says. And in my lifetime, I have a few Rebbes, and Alter is one of them. And going back to our earlier conversation about authority, he's a soft authority for me, but his Hebrew is a whole lot better than mine, and in the critical material he has in front of him when he does this translation is a whole lot more than I have, which is zero. So I respect what he has to say, but he could be wrong. He could totally be wrong. So we come to the end of the book. It's a great one. I'm glad you all stuck it out. I'm really, and between Joan and me, the length of time that we did our studies, it was as if we had 4 Tikun Layl Tikun Shavuot classes, and not merely 2. I'll give Shana the last word, and then we'll go off, and I'm going to get something to drink and debate whether I'm going to bed or not. Shana, what's up?
I'm being given words?
You raised your hand.
Thank you. That's so kind. Oh, I was doing the clapping emoji. I was clapping for you.
Okay, well, okay. All right. So good class. Thank you all for coming, and hope to see you at Yisker tomorrow if you have somebody for whom you need to say Kaddish, and if not, Friday night is a confirmation. 3 great kids giving 3 great speeches and reading from the Torah on their own. But regardless, I'll see you around. Susan, you're in the building so often these days. I'm sure I'll see you in the building wandering around. And
yeah, all of a sudden I've I've got a lot of jobs I'm doing.
And you're doing them well. We're glad to have you on board.
Thanks.
Layl,
Thank
tell
you,
everybody-
Rabbi. A
Layl,
good
tell-
interpretation.
Yeah, thank you.
That was great.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Mayor. Thanks, Mayor.
Lila
Yep.
Tov.
Let him eat cheesecake.
Yeah.
Lila
Also
Tov.
ice cream.
Well,
Ice cream.
everybody.
Night, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.